Okay, next point. I want to emphasize what the implications of this model are. So now, as I emphasized in the class last time in building models, we're doing deductive exercises. So we're building up a set of assumptions, and we're saying if these assumptions are valid, if they're true, then certain implications will follow logically from that set of assumptions. So I want to emphasize here, what are the implications from this model? So we say, if Smith and Jones have perfect information, I'm going to phrase it this way now. So this is a standard way of expressing it in economics. So perfect information, again, means that they know their preferences, they can represent their preferences with indifference curves, perhaps, or maybe not, but at least they know what their preferences are, and they know the quality of the goods that they're getting in exchange. So if that assumption or set of assumptions is true, if they trade mutually voluntarily, so that means they are trading because they're willing to trade and because it increases their utility, then trade is actually going to make both of them better off. Trade is win-win. It's not win-lose. So one person doesn't gain an advantage over the other in trade in this situation. Both individuals in the trade are actually better off and go home happier than when they came to the market in the first place. And that's where we now start to think about, well, what are the broader implications of this particular result? And we're going to get into that. Now, the Edgeworth box displays humans' propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. And I want to emphasize, that's what Adam Smith said was the natural propensity of humans. Truck means move your product to the marketplace. Barter means negotiate a terms of trade. And here, I haven't gotten into yet like where they might end up exactly. I'm just imagining they're going to talk to each other, maybe offer a terms of trade like to H, and then the other is either going to accept it or not accept it. They come at different times in different weeks. They might offer different terms of trades, and they're going to move somewhere into the box in order to raise up their utility. But there's different positions in the box that sort of will make the exchange a little bit different in character. I want to emphasize or talk about that next. All right, there's also a lot of different ways to describe this particular result. And I want to highlight some of the other terminology that I'll use sometimes. And I don't want you to misinterpret or not recognize that it's connected to this particular result. So we can talk about that trade into the lens generates surplus value. And this is a good way of thinking about it. They had value in the original endowment that they came to the market with. So they could have just stayed and Smith could have consumed his 10 oranges and been happy to some degree with that, right? But because he was able to trade with Jones into the lens, there's extra value created for Smith. So there's surplus, extra value out of the trade. And there's surplus value for both of them as a result of trade. And this is a term we're going to use later on in the course because we're going to come up with some measures of well-being for consumers and producers called consumer and producer surplus. And that surplus term is analogous to the surplus that's being generated here through trade. I want you to recognize that distinction then, so I'm making the point now. Now, that surplus is distributed between Smith and Jones, okay? Smith is getting some of the surplus, Jones is getting some of the surplus. But if the trade, next bullet point here, if the trade is to a point near the blue indifference curve, so let's say they're at E and they move to a point like, let's call this one L. All right, at that particular point, notice that Smith is moving to a way higher indifference curve. I could draw one in here and it would look something like this for Smith maybe, right? But Jones is only getting to a slightly higher indifference curve there. All right, so if they were to trade to a point like L on the diagram, well, Smith is getting a lot of the surplus. Jones is becoming better off, sure, but he's only getting a little bit of the extra surplus, right? So Smith would certainly prefer to move to a point like L than to a point like H or a point like F, for example, okay? Because he's going to get a much higher level of surplus. Similarly, if they were to trade to a point here, like M, then we're trading to a point that's close to the red indifference curve, that's Smith's, and therefore Jones is going to get a much higher level of utility jumping out this way, while Smith is just going to get a small level of increase in utility. So the surplus is going to be distributed more in the direction or more in favor of Jones and less in favor of Smith. Now, we could now get into some questions like, what is it really that's going to determine how the negotiation goes? They're going to barter over the terms of trade and make a decision about who gets what. But how, we would ask, are they actually going to determine what that terms of trade will be? Will there be any regularity to it? Will there be any consistency to how they decide to trade? And here we can start to imagine all sorts of real world complications or issues. So, for example, we might imagine that Smith and Jones have different bargaining capabilities or capacities. Maybe Smith is a smooth talker and it tells lots of good stories and can weave a tale about why L is the very best place that they ought to trade to. And Jones is going to be better off, so why should he care? It's going to be good for him. And maybe Jones isn't quite sure, and maybe there's going to be differences in capacities. And that's going to allow Smith to sort of take advantage of Jones in a certain way. But if I tell a story like that, we want to be careful and recognize that I've now relaxed an assumption a little bit. I've relaxed the assumption of perfect information where Smith and Jones know everything about all of the products and all of the different bundles and what utility they give to them. Now we're giving each of them different capacities to kind of use the information that's out there in order to work either towards or against their advantage. Right? And that is a complication of the model that could lead us anywhere, really, in terms of what the outcome might be. Right? So economists have thought hard about this, and this actual sort of bargaining situation is something that's been studied extensively in the economics literature.